Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today we have a fun, kind of rather lighthearted video for you with two friends of mine who've been on the channel before, both multiple times actually, I believe. Um, so Samuel Watkinson, Joe Schmid, most of you may know them. In case you do not, I'll let them each take a second here to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Sam, since it's been a little longer since you've been on.
Sure. I think I introduced myself last time just in terms of the fact that I'm a history and theology student in New Zealand. And I'm interested in apologetics, but not usually in defending it necessarily. Yeah, I don't know what else to say apart from just that I study history and theology, and I'm interested in engaging with atheists and skeptics from a Christian perspective, yes, but to try and make the conversation more constructive, which is one of the aims of this video, I guess. Yeah.
All right, very Rasmussenian of you. Awesome, I love it. All right, Joe, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Joe. You can check me out on my channel, Majesty of Reason, YouTube channel. I mean, it's the biggest, the baddest, the best YouTube channel on the platform. Believe me, folks. I mean, I'm telling you. But yeah, other than that, I do both popular and scholarly work in philosophy. So I guess there's one other thing that we should say is that this does say 10 questions for atheists, but only one among us three is actually an atheist. So but we each have a lot of stuff that we want to say on behalf of atheists in this video. So
Yeah, it's a good point. That gets me into what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about going through Trinity Radio's recent video by Braxton Hunter as 10 Questions for Atheists. Figured we just go through this. We have three different perspectives. Yeah, of course, me being the only one, Joe being an agnostic, and Samuel being, I believe he described himself as an agnostic Christian. So we've got three different perspectives going into this, but we're just going to kind of chat about it. I've not actually seen this entire video, so hopefully some of it will catch me off guard and that'll produce some great content. So I'm going to go ahead and share this here and double check to make sure you guys should be able to see and hear everything. So I'll just play the intro and make sure you guys can see and hear it all.
The
Everything good?
worldview
Okay.
discussions space can be so combative. And when atheists and Christians come up with lists of questions that they don't think the other side can answer, those questions usually aren't genuine. I've never made a list like that, although I've responded to some. Here, I hope my atheist interlocutors will consider these questions deeply without giving glib answers. These aren't meant to be gotcha questions, though I'm not asking for no reason. I expect you will have answers, and I want to hear what the most sincere among you have to say. With that, here are my 10 questions for atheists. What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is, does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about you, your worldview that includes atheism. I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions, science, and differences among different denominations of Christianity. But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences, free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and our shared longing for purpose and meaning. So what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
Okay. I guess he gave us a bit of a laundry list there of things. We don't have to go through each of them. I'm not going to talk about, the argument from beauty individually, then go through the argument from the resurrection. We'll just, I guess we can talk briefly about it. I guess I'll start for now. As for me, I mean, the fact that he said he can't think of any, I feel like even if you think that, is true, you should at least understand that initially to a lot of people, it strikes them that certain facts about evil, at least evidentially, like, the amounts of horrendous evil, not getting into specific definitions of horrendous, but it seems to strike a lot of people, including me, that say a worldview that, excludes God makes better sense of a lot of, amounts of evil various. That's as far as I mean, I don't really focus in my approach personally on trying to point out things that, Christians can't explain and I can't. I more so prefer an approach, as anybody who's, knows my body of work knows, I much prefer like something like Graham Oppy's approach, which is to say that we both can explain basically all of this. The question is then to look at theoretical virtues of the explanations on offer. So my proposed kind of methodology for these kind of questions is not to try to pick through things that, one side can't answer at all and one maybe can, but it does strike me, at least to my lights, that say naturalism, for example, to me seems to make a lot better sense of the amounts of natural evil, evolutionary evil, animal suffering than that makes more sense to me on naturalism than a kind of Christian theism, particularly given some of particular Christian views on things. But other than that, I mean, as I said, I don't really want to get too far into the weeds on, at least not before letting you guys talk on like all the stuff about religious experience, supernatural claims. I do have a lot to say about that because I've been thinking about this recently. But again, we don't have to get into all that. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you guys. I don't know, Joe, do you want to go first, I guess, and just kind of know your thoughts? That's my preliminary stuff.
Yeah. So, well, the first thing is just a kind of, I guess, housekeeping is that maybe for the next clips we could do like 1.5 speed, just because it's a bit slow for the normal speed. But
good idea.
That's just housekeeping. So the second thing that I wanted to say is that I don't think this should be cast in terms of explanation. Rather, I mean, it should be, if we're good Bayesians, it should be cast in terms of the expectability of the various pieces of evidence or the pieces of data on the hypotheses in question. On pretty much any, I mean, you can concoct any theory or any account that explains the data. I mean, really what we want is predicting the data, is giving an account, giving a hypothesis on which the data is more expected than the rival hypothesis. And so it's not as though we need to pinpoint anything that, Christianity cannot explain, or, it's maybe defective explanations. Rather, we just need to look at the expectability of the evidence given certain hypotheses. And I would argue that given, for instance, something like a hypothesis of indifference, which is that whatever produced biological organisms is indifferent to their flourishing and languishing, that's compatible with atheism and naturalism, but it doesn't entail them. If we have that hypothesis on offer versus theism, which has all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God at the foundation, it seems to me that the hypothesis of difference makes a lot more sense of a significant portion of our data. The seemingly random distribution of pains and pleasures, the biological gratuity of pain and pleasure that Paul Draper has worked on, a bunch of things that Jeff Lauder and Daniel Linford have worked on, like hundreds of millions of years of profound languishing and suffering and anguish in the evolutionary process. Prima facie, on the hypothesis that fundamental reality is ultimately indifferent to the flourishing and languishing of sentient life, it seems as though that's not at all surprising, that there would just be this grueling hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering, whereas on the hypothesis of theism, that does seem unexpected. It's not to say that it's incompatible, it's just to say that it's unexpected. And then finally, this is my final note before turning it over to Samuel, is Felipe Leon's argument for material causality, for instance. So if we take Christianity to include definitionally ex nihilo creation, well, then plausibly we might be able to make a case that there is some fact about reality, namely the truth of the principle of material causality, that Christianity cannot account for and is in fact incompatible with it. Now, whether or not the principle of material causality is true, that's of course a question for another day. I actually had a discussion with Micah on my channel with Felipe Leon discussing the principle and the argument behind it. But yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Samuel.
All right, thanks. That was great. Yeah, Sam, what do you got?
Can you hear me firstly? Yes. Sweet. Okay. Yeah. Whenever Christians ask non-Christians the question of whether their worldview can account for, X, Y, Z facts, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to that kind of question because obviously I am a Christian, and I also think that and therefore I think that Christianity does make sense. It's a sense-making religion, if you will. It does make sense of a whole lot of facts, as he put it. But on the other hand, when people ask this question, I also don't think Christians are being, how do I put it, sufficiently sympathetic or empathetic with non-believers, as they would put, they speak of non-believers, yeah, or non-Christians. And the reason why I say that is because, as you say, Joe, you can explain the data using whatever, but that the explanation is not the most important thing. The most important thing to ask is whether is to inquire the specific person that you're talking to, whether based on their background experiences and all that sort of thing, how they can see how the Christian vision of reality, makes sense. And so to try and enter into the Christian worldview, essentially, even if they don't agree with it, I think what Christians should be doing is not so much saying that, you atheist, you can't account for, X, Y, Z facts or whatever, but rather, offering the non-Christian and saying, here's how I view the world, as through the Christian vision of reality. And I understand if this doesn't make sense to you because of whatever experiences you have or whatever, that's fine. So not, giving, pressuring them to say, you must agree with me that Christianity incontrovertibly explains all the facts of reality. Because I don't think it, even though I'm a Christian, I hope that Christianity is true. That's why I call myself an agnostic Christian. I don't think Christianity, Christian faith to be more specific, is something that should be a certain venture, if you will. It's not something you can't be certain. Anyway, I think I'll just finish there for the moment. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Okay. Yeah, no, that was good. Thanks, both of you guys. That was great. I think this, if I remember correctly from what I have seen, I think this second one will be pretty quick. But let's just...
One last thing, just in answering, like,
yeah.
What are these facts that you can and can't explain? This, I mean, obviously this sounds like a shameless plug, but it's really not. It's a video I poured my heart into. The Why Am I Agnostic video, it's on my channel. It's just called Why Am I Agnostic? I go through systematically the different things that I actually think do favor theism and do favor naturalism, that naturalism can account for better than Christianity or better than theism and so on. And so I for a more substantive and rigorous and systematic treatment of this, I point listeners to that video.
Yeah, me too. That's a good, All right. So let's see here. And as Joe said, this would probably be good to put on a higher speed. Here we go. There we are. All right.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God? After all, these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist. And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
Man, I hadn't thought about that one, guys. I'm going to have to... Dang. I don't define atheism that way, and nobody who's taken seriously in philosophy of religion does. This is the question. That's a question for, internet atheists who make anti-fundamentalist memes, which is like fair enough. So I don't know if either of you want to say anything about that one, but I feel like all we need to say is just that, nobody who really takes their atheism seriously defines it that way. So it's kind of a non-issue. I mean, it's a good question for those people. But
yeah, no, so I definitely wanted to say some quick things in this. So I think that really what this is helping to distinguish is the distinction between new atheism on the one hand and atheism on the other hand. New atheism and atheism, right? There's a distinction there. New atheism has a whole host of implausible claims within it, like including the claim that atheism is just a lack of belief and there's no evidence for God's existence and you need to have some sort of scientific evidence and things like that, versus atheism simpliciter, which can be philosophically robust, a la people like Felipe Leon, Graham Oppie, Paul Draper, Stephen Meitzen, and those people. And so I think his question really is, this one should be directed to new atheists, not atheists. But for people who think that atheism is a lack of belief, I mean, well, first of all, the professional philosophers of religion by and large, do not accept that. In fact, the most formidable atheists decidedly reject that. Secondly, it just has counterexamples. So, for instance, electrons lack a belief in God, but they're not atheists. I mean, if we want to say that they're atheists, then the amount of atheists in existence is like 10 to the power of 100, way more than that. Because, you know, that's how many like particles. I think it's 10 to the 80 of how many particles are estimated to be in existence. And of course, you have the things built up out of the particles, many of which are like rocks and stones and galaxies. So they might try to alter it. Oh, well, it's people. Well, then you get the problem of like babies, and you get the problem of agnostics who are genuinely undecided. So they lack a belief, but they're not atheists. They're decidedly agnostics. They're about 50-50. And so there are so many different counterexamples to this kind of account of atheism that it's just wrong.
Yep, agreed. This one.
Oh, and also, I just want to emphasize that serious atheists don't treat God like fairies or leprechauns or Santa Claus. Yeah, that's just like a caricature. That's uncharitable. Yeah. I'm not saying Braxton's being uncharitable to atheists. I'm saying the new atheists that do use those comparisons, like Santa Claus, they're being uncharitable to robust philosophical forms of theism.
Yep, agreed on all that. Good stuff. Sam, did you want to throw anything in there? Or are we good to keep going?
Or just one brief comment. I'm not entirely sure what he's actually trying to ask in this question. But one comment I just want to make, whether this actually directly answers this question or not, is that if we distinguish, the new atheist usual characterization of atheism as a lack of belief from maybe more sophisticated forms of atheism, which can still argue that atheism is a kind of
I think you froze on us.
Oh no!
Is it frozen for you too? Okay.
Yeah.
That's just me.
Oh man.
Uh-oh.
So, looks like we're just gonna have to
distinguish between more sophisticated forms of defining atheism as a lack of belief, like the new atheist types, and from the new atheist types is what I meant. Sorry. So for example, like in the
Okay, so we had some minor technical difficulties with Samuel there as he's calling in from New Zealand, but we're hopefully should be fine now, and we're just going to go ahead for the time being and move on to the third argument. We said at least minimally what needs to be said about that second one. It largely doesn't apply to people who know how to define atheism. That's the takeaway. So without further ado, we're going to jump here into the third point, which I'm curious to see what it is. So here we go. I should still be on the right speed.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things. I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military. I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know about this one. Joe, do you want to start since I started last time? No, I don't know. I guess I will. I guess I can understand how you would maybe think that. I mean, it's kind of a common trope amongst evangelicals to think that secular worldviews are just the result of wanting to sin or something, or some sort of rebellion. Okay, I mean, a lot of stuff he said is true. I changed my position on some things from when I was, religious, but not necessarily for the same reasons. I still had a good number of the same moral beliefs when I became an agnostic originally, like 2 years ago or whatever. And it was sort of a gradual change to believing other things as far as sexual ethics and some politics goes. I was still pro-life for months after that until I started reading some more. Not to say that like once you read it, you become pro-choice. I'm just saying I wasn't I hadn't researched it much myself, and I didn't change my position on that. Politics, I was still relatively right-wing for a while. Sexual ethics, I guess I was still probably had some of the similar views. Some of the stuff he said in there, I'm like, yeah, that's not that bad. What's the problem? But I understand for, of course, Christians why they think it's a problem. Yeah, I mean, to the, if you do interpret that as people just kind of wanting to rebel and sin, that's fine. I mean, I guess I can see how that can send that message if you're being really uncharitable to people in their life experiences. Not that it should send that message, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the question exactly is supposed to be. The question part of it was, can you see how I can send that message? I'm like, I'm not sure that's super relevant. I guess I can see how it can, but most of the time the people that make those kind of claims are pretty, unsophisticated in terms of their critical thinking about religion and atheists. So yeah, not something I'm super concerned with. I guess there's an interesting empirical question as far as how people's beliefs correlate to religious beliefs politically and ethically, but I'm not going to get into the weeds of addressing that here. Yeah, I guess we'll just go to Joe. Anything? I mean, we can be relatively quick about this one because we still got 7 to get through. But yeah, anything else?
No, that's cool. So I guess the main thing that I would say in response to this one is that it's going to be so dependent on the person. It's going to be so, people's beliefs and their worldviews are so intimately bound up with their prior experiences, with their seemings and their what seems to them to be plausible, right? So, and that's going to be a different concoction of different factors for different people. And so I think that it's really going to be an individual by individual basis. And so whether or not that's a charitable interpretation of someone is going to vary by who you're talking about. And so as a categorical statement, no, I wouldn't grant that atheism could send that message or things like that as a categorical statement, because I think we should take this on an individual by individual basis. For some individuals, absolutely. For others, no, that's just a ludicrous, uncharitable thing. And so I disagree with categorically sending that kind of message.
Yep, agree. Good way to put it. Sam, you want to throw anything in there? Because Samuel, you probably have some unconventional beliefs compared to some other Christians based on, in terms of politics, sexual ethics, that kind of thing. So again, we can move through this one kind of quick, but did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've lots of things to say in that response to that kind of question, but I just think that the problem that is displayed through asking that question is the evangelical, a certain evangelical culture which guilts people into certain lifestyles being, intrinsically immoral. But not just that, implying that Christianity is a kind of conservative package, if you will. Now, you can't, on the one hand, according to a lot of these conservatives, you can't accept gay marriage while also being pro-life, for example, which is my position, by the way. So a lot of these positions, conservative Christians, they lump all of these quote-unquote liberal positions together, as if, if you don't accept, on the dot, every single conservative Christian sexual ethic or other moral ethic or whatever, then, you will inevitably be like an immoral person who's defending prostitution. But I don't defend prostitution. I'm against prostitution. And I think not just Christians, but all Christians, all people, they should be looking at how people get into prostitution, what socioeconomic factors causes people to, drives people to want to become prostitutes and to lead those kind of lifestyles, rather than, when, a conservative Christian becomes suddenly a person who is a prostitute, just for example, right? Condemning that person, for example. I've heard many stories of, people who take an invert, they invert their lifestyle almost like a 180-degree turn. They go from being a very conservative fundamentalist person, to being a very, what you could call not just sexually liberated, but they feel that they are liberated from, the oppression of religion or whatever. And I think Christians need to look at why they need to address this false dichotomy, basically. between, a packaged secular lifestyle and a packaged conservative Christian lifestyle. That's the issue that I see in this question. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Agreed on both of everything you guys said. Good stuff. Let's jump in and see what he has for us in this next one here.
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief, as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
I don't even want to really stop to share for that one. We basically covered that already. Do you guys want to, okay, I'm not a lack-theist. How many times I got to tell you, man? Obviously, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, do we need to really say much more about that one?
I mean, to be fair to him, like a lot of people on the internet do kind of claim that this is what atheism is, right? But
yeah, for sure.
Those people need to read philosophy of religion literature.
Yep.
That's all. That's all.
Can I just say one?
Yeah, sure.
Can I just add one thing, which I was going to say earlier before we cut our video off earlier, which is that when it comes to asking an atheist what is their credence, probability, or percentage, or whatever, I think on the one hand that's a really good question to ask, because it gets atheists to reflect on their credences, they're be self-critical, right? But on the other hand, I think if the answer you're expecting, in asking this question is a kind of dichotomy between atheist, theist, like a confident atheist versus a confident theist, then I think that's the problem, essentially. One point I was going to make, which I was going to make earlier, is that I think it's important to distinguish, as some historians, as well as John Schellenberg in his work has also made this distinction between non-belief, just mere non-belief, not believing, and active disbelief or unbelief, right? And the reason why I think this distinction is more sophisticated than the usual atheist, new atheist lack of belief, is because I think a disbelief can be defined as as a positive conviction that you have that religious tenets are false, whereas like an unbelief or non-belief is kind of just an inability to accept religious tenets, right? So I'm sure there'll be atheists who lean more agnostic, for example, like you, Joe. Not that you're an atheist, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there'll be atheists who they feel that they just can't accept religious tenets or dogma or whatever. But that doesn't mean that they have like a really confident disbelief, in atheism or even against Christianity or whatever, right? So yeah, that's the point I wanted to make there. So.
Okay, good. Yeah, glad you got that one in, and it wasn't the point that was cursed. That's good. Good to know. But all right, sweet. Let's jump back in here.
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those? It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe, and all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism. My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this: when you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit? It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
Yeah, in terms of like what do I think about it outside of the debate mode? When it comes to questions of like ultimate cosmological origins, my favorite thing to do is just be like, I don't really know. There's a lot of metaphysical theses right there, and Graham Oppy's written a lot about this in terms of when we talk about cosmology, cosmological arguments, cosmological origins. There's so much to sift through in terms of causality and understandings of causality and modality, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, I think the dichotomy he presented there is false. This sort of past infinity or multiverses versus uncaused out of nothing. That's not a dichotomy I accept. Again, there are naturalistic models upon which there are necessary beings, either one or multiple, and then modal views that branch from there that help explain things. And I honestly, because of some arguments based on the PSR by like Ricky Bliss, I'm sometimes find myself sort of like pondering a infinite regression causal model as like just being interesting. So I don't think just dismissing those out of hand is a good strategy. I just kind of like to play with some different theories on this. I don't really have a super settled view. I like some of the necessary foundation models. But so my point to get across here is just that there's a lot to say about this, and it's very complicated, and so it's hard to get a soundbite of somebody's view on it. But that dichotomy between just uncaused out of nothing versus infinity, that's not really a model any philosophers of religion working on this would accept. At least I don't think so. So that's the main thing I want to get across. That's not a true dichotomy. And again, audience in this video, at least the first 5 questions, seems to be more so the new atheist crowd, people that would read Lawrence Krauss's book and be like, yeah, exactly. So I get the dialectical context there. But as far as my answer, I just say, I think, being comfortable with not knowing is sort of an essential part of doing philosophy, especially when we're talking things that are so far removed. And Felipe Leon's talked about this, modal skepticism. We're talking about things that are so far removed from our experience and so far removed from what we normally know about in terms of when we talk about knowledge. I'm fine with kind of being open and having theories and models that I like and maybe prefer over others, but not really committing to one. But just to say, there are a lot of options that atheists have. It's also worth pointing out that atheists have a broad range of metaphysical views amongst themselves as an umbrella. But yeah, I mean, we could talk about just this point forever. Samuel's freezing a little bit, but we should still be fine, hopefully. There's a lot that we could spend, a 2-hour video just on this point, based talking about cosmological origins. But in the interest of being somewhat brief, that's all I'll say about it for now. Joe, I'll turn it over to you here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my main thing is that it also seems to me to be a false dichotomy or trichotomy, and especially characterizing views that, number one, aren't positing a past infinity, and views that aren't having something coming out of nothing, characterizing those as desperate. That just seems to me to be uncharitable. I mean, there are lots of models within philosophy of religion, philosophy of physics, philosophy of time, that are non-theistic, but which both avoid an infinite past and don't have something coming out of nothing. And they don't seem to, they're not ad hoc, they're not desperate. I mean, it just, that seemed to me to be a bit uncharitable. Now, like one such model, I mean, you could say that there's some kind of, maybe foundational reality is a kind of neutral monist stuff, neutral monist substance. So that's a view in philosophy of mind. And so this kind of fundamental stuff, you could say, pre-existed the beginning of the universe. Maybe it was only ontologically prior to the universe in a kind of timeless sense. I see that we've lost Samuel. You're muted, Micah.
Sorry, I was gonna say, just keep going on with your point, and you'll see what happens with him here. Yeah, just round this one out, and we'll see.
Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah, I was talking about. Okay, yeah. I'm ready to begin whenever. You're gonna have to cut this out. I was saying before Samuel disconnected again, unfortunately, that I was a bit distracted because of that. But there are views in philosophy of mind according to which reality is kind of this neutral monist substance or neutral monist stuff, and it has various different properties, different aspects. And on this view, we could have this kind of neutral monist underlying fundamental substance that could be, it could exist ontologically prior to the beginning of time, and it could be timeless sans the existence of time and temporal with time, a la Craig's view. It's just a non-theistic kind of William Lane Craig view. You could also have kind of non-metric or amorphous time prior to creation, in which the fundamental neutral monist substance exists, or maybe a fundamental quantum field exists in a state that's non-metric and metrically amorphous prior to creation. For a view like that with respect to theism, Ryan Mullins defends that view, Richard Swinburne defends that view, and it's just a non-theistic version of Ryan Mullins and Swinburne's view with respect to the origin of the universe. Because again, the beginning of the universe, that's only the beginning of metric time. And then, finally, I just think that, you could also have naturalist-friendly versions that aren't neutral monist. You could have some kind of fundamental quantum field, or maybe the universal wave function, or what have you. Popular views in the philosophy of physics that different metaphysicians are working on which there's this kind of naturalistic foundation. And it could be, like just one fundamental quantum field, and it exists prior to creation. So it didn't begin to exist because it either exists in this non-metric time, which there aren't any sort of beginnings or comings into being. And on this view, the past is finite. So, it would just indeterministically or spontaneously give rise to the existence of the universe. And so you avoid a kind of modal collapse, because if it necessarily gave rise to it and it's necessarily existent, then the universe would be necessarily existent. And so on this, you get pretty much all the desiderata, right? You get a finite past. You get whatever begins to exist has a cause. You get every contingent thing is explained. You get all this sort of stuff, and it's perfectly compatible with naturalism, and it's not ad hoc. It's not desperate. It's perfectly respectable. So I know that was a bit long, but I'm passionate about this particular point. So
Yeah, I know you are. We've talked about this one a lot. So yeah, that's good in the way of response. Sam, you have anything to add?
Hopefully I can add something, by which I make it if it doesn't freeze again. But yeah, when it comes to the question of the origin of the universe, that's a question that personally I don't really care that much about, because I'm a classical theist, which, even if you don't like the distinction between the classical theism and theistic personalism, Joe, for the moment I'm going to make it. Because I'm persuaded by roughly Aquinas's view, where it doesn't really matter whether the universe has a beginning or whatever. And it doesn't, even though Christians believe in faith that the universe had a beginning and is created by God and all that sort of thing. I don't think the origins of the universe is actually the right sort of question to what I'm trying to say is I don't like these forms of argument.
you just like
which
the
is the point
sustaining cause. Yeah, you're going to want to use the kind of sustaining cause arguments instead of the originating cause arguments from the finitude of the past.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's also just so like to make the point that Dave Bentley Hart makes in his book, The Experience of God, at the risk of caricaturing the theistic personalist view, Joe, the theistic personalist God is often, as a personal agent, whereas classical theist is not really a being or an agent per se, even though it's analogously like an agent. And so that's kind of why, like for me personally, I understand on the one hand why Braxton would think that it would destabilize an atheist or destabilize anyone. How can you not have a personal agent, causing, because humans think in terms of personal agents because of our hyperactive agency detection thing that we have,
Device,
device or whatever.
HADD.
HADD, yeah. And so I understand. I understand why it's natural to think that way, but I just don't think that just because it's intuitive, it necessarily means it's true. So in that sense, I agree with atheists. Ironically, that the intuition, the intuitive force that's often behind like the fine-tuning argument, or all those other design arguments which try to explain a certain feature of reality. Right. I understand the intuitive force behind them, but I don't really personally find them persuasive, and I don't think people should. But anyway, so that's just my view on that question.
Okay. All right. Good. Yep. We're gonna Joe's gonna have to hold all the rage in from the theistic personalism comments. It's fine. He'll just bottle it up. And so yeah, good by way of response to that. That one was, at least I found, pretty interesting in a sense. So let's go on here. I think we're on 6. So.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest? Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
Okay, this is a good question for a couple reasons, because you get to understand, like, to ask atheists, because then you kind of get a feel for like if they actually know the arguments, because they come out with something really dumb. They're like, yeah, well, I don't even know what an example, but so it's good to know, kind of who you're dealing with. So it's a good question to ask, I guess. And I would say for me, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of fascinating arguments for theism that are plausible, and people are rational to agree with the arguments, and to hold to them, whatever, be convinced by them. I also think it's rational to not be convinced by them, of course, but it goes both ways essentially. As far as, I guess it's kind of at that point it gets down to a personal question as far as like which ones are your favorites. And I guess for me, I find probably some version of cosmological arguments from contingency to be the strongest as far as the ones that have always been most convincing to me. But I also have this kind of fascination with some of the more like Neoplatonic considerations people have about this stuff. And then there's some I haven't looked into as much, like fine tuning, that strike me as interesting. But as far as stuff that personally convinces me, or I think is the best personally convincing, sure, probably something, some version of a Rasmussen-Proust style contingency argument is probably the strongest argument for theism that I've seen, but much more to research on that. But what about you, Joe?
Yeah, my answer to that, well, of course, I defer to the Why Am I Agnostic video, because I go through what makes me think theism is plausible. But one of them is the major ones that Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen develop in their book Necessary Existence. It's just filled with, it's very good philosophy of religion. And they go through a bunch of different arguments from contingency. It's basically stage one, so they're just getting to necessary being, which I think, that's perfectly compatible with naturalism. But, it's still, it's getting rid of some barriers that some people have to theism. So I would also say cosmological arguments from contingency. And other than that, I mean, one that I find interesting is, I guess, arguments from abstracta for God's existence. Like abstracta seem to have these weird features that are characteristic of minds. I mean, like intentionality, and they can be true or false. They can correctly represent. And somehow we also have cognitive access to them, which is pretty spooky under naturalism. But anyway, so those are ones that I think are interesting among theistic arguments.
Okay, well, and Samuel, you being a theist might have a little different answer to this one. I mean, but yeah, go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking about asking this question, like whether perhaps, I could answer the opposite. What are my interesting atheist arguments? But maybe I'll just answer the question directly. For me personally, as someone who is a fan of David Bentley Hart and his work, I find the three main arguments.
Tell, really? You sure? Yeah.
the three main arguments in his book, The Experience of God, quite compelling. So he structures it in terms of the Sanskrit phrase Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. And I find all of those arguments very interesting and very compelling personally. But probably the most compelling for me is actually the last one, bliss. And I'll explain how this could be like an argument. It's basically explaining the transcendentals, like truth, beauty, and goodness, right? So I personally find, while a lot of the arguments Hart makes in the first half to do with explaining being, those are very similar to the cosmological arguments that Rasmussen and others make, right? Even if they have a more classical theist kind of tinge to them, right? While I find those arguments convincing, I find an argument from transcendentals, which, by the way, don't confuse with the presuppositionalist transcendental argument, because that's a really bad argument, because it's made by presuppositionalists. But basically, I just mean an argument which I find an argument which looks at universals or transcendentals like truth, beauty, goodness, and tries to account, essentially, or I don't want to use the word account because that's the word that he used earlier. But you know what I mean? Like, it tries to, for me, it's, the classical theism makes best sense. It's the best way to put it, I guess. It makes best sense of beauty, goodness, and truth, because God is beauty, goodness, and truth. As all classical theists say, right? Yes. So that's personally my favorite and most interesting.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that section of Hart's book is really like poetic, if nothing else. It's fantastic to read. But yeah, okay. So let's see here. Let's keep going. That was a fun one.
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough. So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you? Do you know? And since it's often a conversation stopper, let's take experimental reproducibility off the table, since that's not even always necessary for science.
Well, he predicted what I was going to say. I was just going to ask if we could, find God with like test tubes and crap, but I guess he was ready for me on that one. He's playing the 4D chess of the philosophy of religion. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't think of evidence the same way new atheists do. I think I don't think you need demonstrations to believe things. In fact, I think demonstrations are very few and far between in philosophy. Yeah, I guess that's all I really have to say about it is, when you look at kind of abductive analysis and kind of maybe even sort of, what's the term I'm looking for? But you look at like something like what Swinburne does in terms of taking all these facts and putting them into like a Bayesian calculus.
Cumulative case
and, like,
approach, is that what you're thinking?
yeah, cumulative. That's a great one to forget. Yeah, so it's kind of a cumulative case, although of course I think, if individual arguments fail, the cumulative case fails, whatever. But in terms of, I think that's perfectly fine way to do evidential analysis the way Swinburne does. I don't think it has to be necessarily always empirical in the sense that new atheists mean empirical, in the sense of like we have to do repeatable verifiability. I guess he's asking a little bit like what would it take to convince you. I'm not sure as far as like what exact evidence I would need or how much is what it would take to shift my credences from where they're at. I don't really know. I feel like I have a generally decent grasp in terms of what's going on in the field, so I know the arguments, at least some of the popular ones, like the Rasmussen Proust style contingency. So yeah, it's hard to. I guess this would require taking a look at like our arguments and how will those predict future arguments. I'm not entirely sure what it would take to change my mind. I think it's epistemically possible that I would change my mind. Sure, I think there is, at least it's coherent to think that there is some set of evidence that would make me change my mind. I don't know exactly what that would look like. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it more in terms of order to give you a list. But it's not an exact science, right? Belief, knowledge, in terms of epistemology, it's not an exact thing in terms of like I could give you a numbered list of like, well, if you showed me this thing at this time, then I'd have to accept. Like, no, it's not like that. There's a broader methodology behind all this. That's all I'll say about it for now. Joe, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to the fact that our beliefs, our worldviews are generated by this whole concoction of factors, many of which are non-rational. I mean, we know from the psychological literature that it's simply false that we hold our beliefs in this kind of robotic, rationalistic way, that like, we're just solely responsive to reasons. There are all sorts of factors that come in from social factors, environmental factors, your desires even. The evidence that you've looked at thus far, your life experiences, things like that. There are so many different, that's not to say, of course, that, the rational factors are irrelevant, but they are one set or subset of factors among other factors. And so it's very difficult to say what would change an individual person's mind. And even for that individual person, it's very difficult because it's a near infinitude of causal factors that lead to them holding their beliefs to the point that it's very difficult to get a handle on, what it would take. So I guess that's my main thing. It's like, I don't quite know. I mean, presumably my answer, I mean, if I give it a best shot, is just like, if we go to those things that I was discussing in my Why Am I an Agnostic video, if we could knock out some of the ones for naturalism, if we could knock those out, or if we could add more ones to the theism side, or increase ones that I didn't think were as strong, like if we could do some of that, we could do some of this shifting, then that would presumably shift my epistemic credence. And so I guess that's my thing, like either add new arguments to the theist side or strengthen arguments on the theist side, or contrary-wise, take off arguments from the naturalist side or weaken arguments from the naturalist side. So I guess that's my response. But I do want to say that the factors that influence and affect our beliefs are pretty much, there are just countless, and it's impossible to predict pretty much.
Yep, I like that. That's good. I know our next question, I'm very excited to hear Sam's thoughts on in particular, but as far as what you have for this one, Yeah, anything to add there, Sam?
Yeah, I have to be honest with this. I thought that the eighth question was the question that yeah, it is the eighth question. Well, the next question, that was going to be the one that irked me the most. But actually, on reflection, I think this is actually the question. The reason why is because once again, on the one hand, I sympathize with this question because it's a question that Christians always ask atheists or anyone who doesn't agree with them. What would convince you? What evidence would convince you to believe exactly the way that I think? It's such a natural question to ask. I've asked the question myself to both atheists and myself. I regularly ask myself, what evidence would it take for me to become more confident that Christianity is true? More confident than I currently am, right? But I don't think this is the right question to ask. To be more precise, when to interrogate the phrase, what it means to be convinced that Christianity is true, what does Braxton mean by that? I want to ask him, because I think when it comes to being convinced that Christianity is true, there is a subtle, even if this is not what he's saying, there's a subtle implied connotation, I guess, that that faith, Christian faith, has been potentially reduced to a set of propositions. Belief that X, Y, Z is true, right? But if we go into the biblical version of faith and just faith in general, it's more accurate to speak of faith in terms of belief in a person, or belief in something or someone you trust, right? This is the point I was making in our first video, Micah, if you remember, about defining faith, right? And I think defining faith is very important when it comes to asking the question of Christianity's truth, and in particular, what does it mean for Christianity to be true? Because for me, Christianity is not true because I'm wholly convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not, or many other propositional claims like that, but rather it's true because it is a set of stories, the Christian mythology, and I don't use it mythology in a denigrating way, right? It's a set of stories which clearly make sense of our experience, and it makes sense for me personally. But that for some people it doesn't make sense, and for that, when it doesn't make sense to those people, that is their truth in a sense, right? And when I say this, I don't mean that truth is just subjective, or relative or whatever. I mean, you need to, and this will probably bleed into the next question of which I anticipate the question, which the question of defining faith needs to be separated from a certain dichotomy, which we will address in the next question, which is the dichotomy between truth or reason and emotions and feelings, right? I think that the emotional or affective side to Christianity's truth is often diminished. It's lost in the conversation in general in apologetics, because apologetics is all about demonstrating the rationality of the Christian worldview, etc. So that's how I would lovingly rebuke my fellow Christian there, Braxton, in saying that there's a temptation, there's a risk when you ask a non-Christian, what would it take to be convinced of Christianity's truth? There's a temptation that you can reduce truth to propositional truth, and ignore the other aspects of truth, which are just as important in my view. So,
okay,
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and I think you'll probably have a little more to say on expounding on that in the next section. So without further ado, let's see what that next section is.
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were. I honestly wonder how much those issues and ones like them motivate the deconversion rather than all this talk about evidence.
Stop the share. There we go. I want to actually turn this one over to Sam pretty quickly because talk about the hell stuff especially. I want to say I think I recounted briefly my story on terms of how that wasn't the case for me. I sort of changed, kind of became agnostic religiously before any of the changes in social, political, moral views. That kind of all came later. But I would also like to say I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think for people who maybe are not aware of more progressive Christianities, if moral issues like that, I'll say this much minimally, this would be a middle ground. Moral issues such as LGBTQ issues, and Braxton may be getting this from, I know he was a former huge fan of Rhett and Link, and their deconversion stories came out, and they talked a lot about how they had some gay friends and family they became very close to, and they moved to LA, and how that kind of made them uncomfortable with the traditional Christian moral teaching on that. And I think that's good in a sense. I don't think there's anything wrong with that move. I'll say at least minimally that if you have almost like a Morean shift because of beliefs, moral beliefs you have, and that leads you out of not Christianity, but if that leads you out of a Christian view on which those things are wrong or on which they're persecuted, then that's fine and that's good. So that's not personally my story. So his kind of conditional there at the beginning of like, if this is your story, it doesn't really apply to me. But to the extent it does, if that leads people to leave evangelical Christianity or maybe a certain version of it, I don't think that's wrong in any way. And the evidence can all come later. But I'll turn it over actually to Sam first on this one, because I know you had some more thoughts about this. Then we'll round off with Joe.
Yeah. So as I was saying in the previous end of the previous question, I just find very, very problematic this dualism which Christians make all the time between facts and feelings, or truth and reason and emotion, or whatever. I mean, you hear it in its most like crude popular form, and Ben Shapiro's facts over feelings nonsense. But you hear it in subtler forms also, like like in this question, for example, where like there's the implication that just because social and moral issues cause someone to deconstruct and become an atheist, that this is necessarily them going away from the truth, capital truth or whatever. But that is what needs to be justified. Like if you want to talk to an atheist or someone who's deconstructed their faith, who's become persuaded that that the conservative, the traditional view of same-sex marriage is wrong, for example, or that the traditional view of hell is wrong, if they already persuaded that they already see that those things are immoral, they've come to a place where their vision has changed, right? Then if you're going to just rant on about the truth in with a capital T to them, they're not going to listen to you. I mean, for one, but they'll just be, so they'll be put off, but when Christians do that, they are objectifying truth. That's what I'm trying to say. And of the objectification of your personal vision, your personal apprehension of the truth into an objective truth of the capital T, it is idolatrous in Christian terms, in my view. It's not how. I mean, even if you're so confident that there has to be an eternal hell, or that LGBT morality is wrong, or whatever, even if you're like really confident, which most Christians are, as usually the case, right? I still think you need to get into the shoes of someone who is not confident. You need to act like Jesus. In other words, you need to, I mean, I could talk about this later, but that's just something that really, that really annoys me with fellow Christians when they have this dualism between emotion and reason. And I've talked a little bit earlier on Micah's channel about some of the historical reasons for why this may be the case, but I to not went on. I'll just say at the moment that, in brief, that historically, if you look at people like Charles Darwin or other agnostics or doubters in the history of the recent history of the Christian past, you'll see that often it's not science or reason, but it's often evolution and the moral issues that come with it, or adamant it's more moral issues which cause people in recent history to question Christian dogma, and I think this should not be dismissed. It has to be acknowledged that the Christian worldview itself has produced within itself a kind of doubting of its own moral coherence, essentially. And I think this needs to be recognized by apologists. Otherwise, they are just preaching to the choir, essentially.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I like to end, kind of half self-plug, half Sam plug here. Check out the previous video he did on my channel on that topic on religion. Joe, what do you have to add here?
Yeah, so I guess I want to make two distinct points. The first one is that, he's asking the person listening, hey, to what extent did these quote unquote non-rational factors influence your deconversion if you did deconvert? So I guess I'll answer that personal question first. To a very minimal extent for me, actually probably a non-existent extent, although, there are tons of factors that influence our beliefs. When my process of doubt sort of started, as many people know who've watched some of my other discussions on other channels, it really started with really trying to confront the sheer horrors in the evolutionary history of life. And it was confronting it from the, evidential Bayesian type, Draper, Lauder type kind of arguments. And so it's not really like LGBT issues or, things like that that were leading me to doubt or anything like that. It was hundreds of millions of years of profound languishing and starvation and predation and parasitism and suffering in the evolutionary process, which is the very means by which God is purported to have brought about biological diversity, the very mechanism by which he created humans. It just seems so unexpected, so surprising to my mind, if theism is indeed true, and much, much less unexpected, that is to say, much more expected, under the hypothesis of indifference. But so I guess that's the question for me myself. And then the second thing that I wanted to go over just briefly is that I also find the posing of the question rather problematic. He was like shouldn't truth be our guide, not like our feelings? And some of these things, like, there are legitimate moral objections. I'm not saying that they're decisive or that they succeed, but there are legitimate moral objections to hell, to the point that many Christians find it entirely unpalatable. You have Christian universalists like Dr. Josh Rasmussen, who gives philosophical arguments based on the nature of justice, on the nature of mercy, on the nature of divine love, on the nature of eternal conscious torment, and so on. Sophisticated arguments that are morality based against these kinds of views and Old Testament atrocities. A lot of Christians say, yeah, if we were to take these passages literally, that would be a big problem for us because we have a God commanding genocide. So we probably shouldn't take these literally. And it's not as though it's ad hoc, right? There are natural interpretations on which these aren't literally God commanding genocide. And I think that those are the most respectable interpretations. It's not ad hoc. But if they were literal, that constitutes, I think, a decent objection to that version of Christianity. It's not as though this is your feelings guiding you. That's just using your noggin. Come on. Again, I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying that these are decisive problems or that, these can't be answered or anything. But to say that this is to even hint or intimate that this is your feelings as opposed to truth oriented, it seems to me to be wrong. So
Yeah, that's great. And just as far as kind of almost dismissing some of these moral, the framing of almost being dismissive of these things when you meet people whose lives it affects in regards to some things surrounding sexual ethics, it becomes less palatable then too, I'll say, from personal experience. But yeah, good good thoughts on all of those. Let's move on here to, I guess we're on 9.
Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject? How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, top-level books, and, let's face it, YouTube videos? And be honest with yourself about this. Anyone can Google up a list of books and paste them in the comments section. But I want to know, are you getting the best from the other side?
Yeah, I think we're all gonna have pretty good answers to this one. We can make it quick though. Yeah, I have read. I mean, my favorite book I've read recently on this would be Josh Rasmussen's books, From the Other Side, How Reason Can Lead to God. I don't know if we would count his dialogue with Felipe Leon. I mean, he gives a positive case there. I enjoy that very much so. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I have done a decent job of trying to dig into literature on this and have face-to-face conversations. People disagree as well. I was recently reading through Alex Pruse's book on the principles of efficient reason, and that was not long ago in preparation for a discussion I was doing, as well as various other things, articles, posts. I'm trying to remember as far as how long ago I read. I mean, Josh's book was earlier this year. I read David Bentley Hart's book this year earlier on universalism. I really love that book. His book on the history of Christianity, his experience of God, I was rereading earlier this year. Yes, I mean, there's a good number as far as yeah. So I feel like personally, yeah, I do try to read the good stuff when and where I can, and I know both of you do as well. So Joe, if you want to run through a list, I mean, listing off 3, I mean, whatever, if you want to just name a couple that you've enjoyed.
Yeah. So definitely Josh's How Reason Can Lead to God. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed that one. Also, Necessary Existence by Alexander Pruss and Rob Coons and Josh Rasmussen. I can't believe I said that. Anyway, the third one would be Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. I kind of have a particular soft spot for that one because they argue for a kind of neoclassical model of God, so which is probably my favorite model of God. And then the fourth one was the dialogue with Felipe Leon and Josh Rasmussen. Is God the best explanation of things? That one was excellent. I even had a reading group with Professor Paul Draper, various grad students at Purdue, and Josh and Felipe themselves. They were in the reading group as well for that book, so that was super duper fun. That was over this past summer. And yeah, so I guess those are my four for here. Now, I almost want to like turn this question over to Braxton. Like, if Braxton's watching this, which maybe he is, I mean, he said he's genuinely curious and how people engage with it. So I'm guessing he's going to watch this. So hi, Braxton. I have a question for you. I'm curious to hear what professional or apologetic atheist books have you read recently that you perhaps found interesting or enjoyed? Again, that's not a gotcha question. But yeah, I mean, I hope, fingers crossed, that it's something like, people like Oppie, Robin Lapoitevin, and others. But yeah.
I do. It's good to do that. I like to. It's a good question to turn over to apologists because they give this one a lot. That's when I was going to be like, well, what about you? Have you read? And so I have a friend and some of them do a good job at it. Like I have a friend on Twitter.
Some of them do, but other ones they're just like Richard Dawkins and then Sam Harris is The End of Faith, and like that, and like no. But I'm not saying that Braxton Hunter would do that. I'm not. So yeah, that's for some people. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend on Twitter. His Twitter handle is Inspiring Christianity. He just recently bought Arguing About Gods, Graham Uppy's huge, like 500-page tome on a taxonomy of arguments. It's like there are people that are doing the good stuff out here. So yeah, it's a good one just to ask people. It's a good question. So Samuel, yeah, what about you? Some inspiring reads. What's your Goodreads list for the year?
So you mean atheist philosophers? Is that the question? For me, would it be?
Well, I think. Well, yeah, I guess because it's the other side. So yeah, you should probably do the
atheist
one.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, my answer probably wouldn't satisfy you guys because I don't read much analytic philosophy or enjoy much.
Like Soren Kierkegaard or something, or like
nah,
Sartre or something.
But I'll give you one recent atheist philosopher that I've been reading. I was reading Jordan Howard Sobel's book, only for the reason that I wanted to see his engagement with the Aquinas' argument, essentially ordered causal series, which I think is because it's one of the arguments obviously that convinces me personally. I found his very. I encourage classical theists to read Sobel's book. It's very very worth reading, even if you disagree with it, as I did in the end. So that's one analytic atheist philosophy I was reading recently. As for non-analytic, which is more my what I mostly read, to be honest. I was reading Nietzsche actually. Yeah, I was. Micah, I was reading Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I encourage Christians to read it, and not just because it shows that Nietzsche is a nihilist. Because it doesn't. You'll find that Nietzsche, if you read him carefully, he's a very ironic person as a writer. You can't really. I mean, analytic philosophers, they might find it difficult to, work out what is Nietzsche actually trying to argue here, But I still think, theists should read people like Nietzsche and other atheist philosophers, not just analytic philosophers. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's good to have a broad range. I enjoy Nietzsche. I know a lot of people, especially in the analytic circles I run in, that don't like Nietzsche, and I'm like, I don't know, this book Zarathustra is probably always going to be one of my favorite books. So, no matter what happens. So, that's good. And Sobel is a fantastic answer, by the way. He's amazing. So okay, I think we got one more to round out here. Let's do it. All right. Question 10.
Let's finish with a pretty common one. If you found out today to your satisfaction that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your king?
Oh, that was it? Oh, that was more abrupt. I mean, barring all the qualifications that Samuel gave on belief, I don't know how that would happen. I would like to think that, though, if I could be shown for certain that something was true, I'd be like, sure, I believe it. I don't have any in principle objection. Of course, I have this almost Nietzschean picture of myself if that view entailed something like eternal conscious torment, just rejecting it on moral grounds, kind of like a reversal of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky said that if he could be shown that the truth was not Christianity, he would prefer to remain with Christ rather than the truth. If the Christianity he's talking about and came along with it some horrible moral baggage like eternal conscious torment, I'd like to think that I would remain with non-Christianity rather than the truth if the truth was that bad. But for all intents and purposes, I mean, that's highly qualified. For all intents and purposes, I mean, sure, I find myself at least aesthetically very drawn to say Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It's another book I was reading earlier was Callisto Ware's book, The Orthodox Way, earlier this year. And I found a lot of what he said about God and mystery and in the Christian way really interesting and kind of convincing at a purely emotional level, if nothing else. So I would not be opposed to that being true at all. And I'd like to think, if it was shown to be true, no problems. I'm in. I'm sure I'm one of you guys now, but or not one of we're all on the same team. Here's my Rasmussenian plug. But what about you, Joe? Would you just remain an agnostic? Would you tell God that he hadn't done the proper Bayesian analysis, or what?
No, he wasn't taking into account the dialectical context. But yeah, absolutely. My response to Braxton's question, I literally just have yes, absolutely. So that's all that I had. I mean, there are a lot of caveats. I mean, how did we get to this position? It's almost like he's just throwing us in there. And like I was saying, there's this huge background that we all bring of our experiences, this whole concoction that I've been talking about. But assuming that we get all that worked out and that, it's shown to my satisfaction, as he said, that Christianity is true, I say absolutely. Yes, sign me up.
Yeah, all right, Sam. This will be an interesting one for you. I mean, you already. Should we ask? I don't know if we should ask you about atheism. If Richard Dawkins came down from a cloud and told you that it was with certainty, I don't know. Would you cross the Tiber as well? I don't know. You don't have the same kind of epistemic because with Christianity you have God could just tell you. So I don't know. Do you have any comments on that one, just in terms of how he's handling terms of faith and all that? Maybe that'd be what you'd have to add there, Sam. I don't know, anything.
Yeah. So Joe, you mentioned yes with all the caveats. I suppose I would just highlight what all those caveats probably are. For most atheists, if I were to, be in their shoes, a lot of those caveats would be interrogating the three things that he mentioned in the question, which are accepting God's authority, repenting of your sins, and trusting Jesus as your king. So what do those three things mean, basically? So what does it mean to accept God's authority? Right? A lot of conservative Christians have a very authoritarian, for lack of a better term, conception of authority, right? And so are Christians, conservative Christians in particular, are they willing to be wrong that the idea of God's authority is not quite accurate? It's not quite Jesus-like, perhaps, I don't know. So yeah, that's the first thing. And then also the repenting of your sins. So what sins do you think, it's just a really loaded question, to be honest. Like, what sins does Braxton think that atheists need to repent of? I don't know. I mean, some sins that you probably agree, Micah, you should repent of, like, but others you would be like, no, I don't want to repent of what you think is a sin, this is not sin at all, So yeah, like, it's just really loaded, what are the sins that need to be repented of, basically, right? Yeah, and so then the third one is, trusting Jesus as your king. This is not as problematic as the first two, because I think that faith, as I said in the first video with you, Micah, is about allegiance. Like it's about allegiance to a king, even if you don't like the kind of kingly, monarchical kind of connotations of allegiance to a king. I still think that the general idea of allegiance is important. But once again, like, allegiance, it depends what you mean by, like, what conception of authority you have when you speak of allegiance, for example. So all of these questions are just really, all of these components to these questions, this question are really loaded for me. So yeah,
it's good to dig into that a little more. Joe and I think we're just like, yeah, sure, but it is good to interrogate, like, what actually is going along with what he's talking about here. But I guess all there's left to say then, that's all 10. So Braxton, again, assuming you're watching, hopefully, hello, you wanted people to answer, you wanted engagement. I mean, you got one, these guys, if you count them, because one's an agnostic and one's an agnostic Christian, but you got some lengthy engagement, hopefully. So thank you for the questions, thank you for the thought-provoking nature of them, and hopefully people who view this on both sides can sort of hopefully come to knowledge of something the other side thinks, or maybe evaluate something they think as well. I'll just round off here with saying thank you to my guests, my interlocutors here, Joe, Sam. It's great to have you guys, both of you, as always, and probably have some future projects with you guys as well, individually, maybe together as well. We'll see. But thank you, everybody, for watching, and see you next time.